It isn't hard to imagine a world where you and everyone you know can be destroyed without warning at the push of a button. This was an actuality for many during a period of 13 days known as the Cuban Missile Crisis, where the world came closest to nuclear devastation. Three major people to remember in this conflict are former US President John F. Kennedy, former Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev, and Prime Minister of Cuba and later President of Cuba, Fidel Castro. Though allies in World War II, after the defeat of Nazi Germany and disagreement on the future of Germany, the US and the Soviet Union became bitter rivals who constantly competed for dominance over the other. In 1946, Germany was divided into two. The Soviet Union controlled the East Bloc and the Western Bloc was controlled by the US and Western allies. A key part of the rivalry was the nuclear arms race. Both nations expanded their nuclear arsenal in October 1959 to deter invasion attempts from the Soviets. The US placed nuclear-tipped Jupiter missiles in Turkey, located approximately 150 miles from the Soviet Union. This move threatened the Soviet Union, but an opportunity to get even with America soon arose. In 1959, the Cuban state was liberated by Fidel Castro and a group of Cuban rebels from the corrupt dictator Fulgencio Batista. However, Fidel Castro turned out to be a communist, making his takeover change Cuba into a communist state. This change was welcomed by the Soviet Union, who themselves are based in communism.
There are many people in the world who really don't understand what is the great issue between the free world and the communist world. Let them come to Berlin.
America was and still is a very anti-communist country, so automatically they were not pleased with the fact that a communist state was right at their border. The President of America at that time, Dwight Eisenhower, placed an embargo on Cuba and decided that Fidel Castro had to be taken care of, so he authorized the CIA to create and sponsor a group of Cuban exiles to invade Cuba and overthrow Fidel Castro. This group was known as Brigade 2506. Dwight Eisenhower couldn't see the invasion mission through since his term ended and JFK became president. However, the invasion plan still proceeded, and on April 17, 1961, the invasion plan was launched from Nicaragua to the Bay of Pigs on the coast of Cuba. In a span of 24 hours, over 100 of the exiles were killed, and more than 1,100 were captured. This was a big loss for America and a huge win for Castro. After the invasion attempt, Fidel Castro was convinced that he needed military support from the Soviet Union. Nikita Khrushchev swiftly agreed and secretly started sending nuclear missiles and military equipment to Cuba. His reasons for doing this was to counteract US missiles that were in Turkey and have a bargaining chip to force West Berlin into joining East Germany. On October 14, 1962, a U-2 spy plane took multiple photos of nuclear missile sites under construction in Cuba. The following day, the US intelligence personnel analyzed the plane's data and found out that the Soviets were building medium-range ballistic missile sites in Cuba. President Kennedy was briefed on the present situation. Secret meetings were held by President Kennedy and a group of government officials later known as the Executive Committee of National Security Council, or EXCOM for short. These meetings were secretly recorded by President Kennedy. During these meetings, the President and the EXCOM discussed options to deal with the missiles in Cuba. These options consisted of inaction, diplomacy, airstrikes, invasion, and a blockade. The majority of military personnel pushed for a full-scale invasion into Cuba. JFK, however, did not favor any aggressive moves, believing such actions would ruin America's image and give the Soviets a justifiable reason to overrun West Berlin. A U-2 spy plane discovered intermediate-range ballistic missile sites in Cuba. This made matters worse since such a missile could virtually reach almost any state in North America. President Kennedy decided on the naval blockade but changed the name to a quarantine, since the term blockade was an act of war. On the following day, the U.S. military alert is placed on DEFCON 3, and that same afternoon, Kennedy publicly announced the situation with Cuba and his plans for a blockade.
Directed that the following initial steps be taken immediately. First, to halt this offensive buildup, a strict quarantine on all offensive military equipment under shipment to Cuba is being initiated. All ships of any kind bound for Cuba from whatever nation or port where they found to contain cargoes of offensive weapons be turned back.
The Cuban Missile Crisis was a time that was very scary for Americans because we were under the threat constantly of nuclear annihilation. I remember when we were in school, we would do drills where we would get under our desk and fold up in a ball, thinking that that was going to protect us from a nuclear attack. Now, during that time frame, it did affect Americans. It was a scary time for us. And the reason why was because of the nuclear attack that was imminent in our minds.
The U.S. Navy moved in to put a blockade on Cuba. The next day, conflict between the U.S. and Soviet vessels built to a dangerous level, and for the first time in U.S. history, the Strategic Air Command is placed at DEFCON 2, a state of military readiness one step away from nuclear warfare. Letters were sent back and forth from the White House to the Kremlin as both leaders tried to communicate and reason with one another, knowing any blunder could potentially mean a nuclear holocaust for this world. On the following day, Fidel Castro sent a letter to Nikita Khrushchev, urging him to launch a nuclear first strike against the U.S. Nikita Khrushchev ignores him and sends a message to Kennedy with an offer to end the crisis, asking the U.S. to lift the quarantine and pledge to not invade Cuba in exchange for the removal of Soviet missiles from Cuba. The 12th day of the Cuban Missile Crisis dawned with the United States and the Soviet Union on the brink of nuclear confrontation. Nikita Khrushchev sends a second message implying that any proposed deal must have the removal of U.S. missiles in Turkey. After a tense discussion with the ex-com, JFK ignored Khrushchev's second message and responded to the first message instead. Kennedy wrote a message to Khrushchev with steps to remove missiles from Cuba and a pledge to not invade Cuba. This critical message was sent through his brother, Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy, who met with Soviet Ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin to finalize this compromise. Robert Kennedy indicated that America was already planning to remove their missiles in Turkey, but the removal of the missiles in Turkey could not reach the public's ears and must be kept secret. The Soviets began to dismantle their missiles by November 1962, and on the following April, the U.S. removed their missiles from Turkey. The Cuban Missile Crisis had a tremendous effect on world history. It created changes in international relations, foreign policy, and served as a route to end the Cold War. For starters, America had to live with the fact that a communist nation was staying at their border. We kept our promise to not invade Cuba, but still kept the embargo. Soviet-Cuba relations were greatly strained due to Cuba's absence in the compromise. After coming so close to destruction, diplomatic negotiations were adopted to deal with conflict. From the crisis to the end of the Soviet Union, more than 5 arms reduction treaties were signed by both nations. This period of improved U.S.-USSR relations is known as the détente. Despite the détente, each side maintained nuclear weapons to destroy the other side, and that either side, if attacked for any reason by the other, would retaliate with equal or greater force. This doctrine of using the threat of destruction and retaliation to prevent destruction is known as mutually assured destruction. The ideas of détente and mutually assured destruction decayed in the late years of the Union, during the Reagan and Gorbachev era. Reagan's willingness to increase pressure on the Union, Mikhail's peaceful nature and reforms along with multiple factors led to the fall of the Union and the end of the Cold War. The course of the détente and peaceful negotiations wouldn't be possible without a dangerous brush with nuclear war. Only through careful cooperations and collaboration could the destructive tendencies of the United States and the Soviet Union have been controlled, and the Cuban Missile Crisis served ultimately to be the road to the détente and the end of the Cold War. The Cuban Missile Crisis will forever hold importance in history as a lesson that shows the dangers of nuclear weapons, a classroom for international affairs and conflict management, and an advocate for the spirit of cooperation and compromise, a spirit that we can only hope will perpetually overcome mankind's self-damaging tendency for conflict and destruction.